The moment the camera locked onto that cockpit, something in our living room shifted, the way the air changes right before a storm tears through. My brother's beer slipped from his fingers. He caught it, barely. My mother's hand flew to her mouth as if she were trying to hold back a sound she wasn't ready to make. My father lurched forward so fast that his recliner nearly pitched him onto the carpet, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, this family, loud, opinionated, always ready with a comment, went absolutely, completely silent. The announcer's voice rolled through the room like something from another world. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Sarah Calloway. My name, my face, my aircraft. Live. Broadcast to millions of Americans who were settled into their own couches, their own living rooms, their own ordinary Saturday afternoons. The same brother who had spent the better part of a decade calling me the family's greatest disappointment stared at the screen the way a man stares at something he cannot make sense of. The same parents who had spent those same years redirecting every dinner conversation back to him couldn't look away from me. Not now. Not anymore. Nobody spoke, nobody cracked a joke, nobody changed the subject. Because the pilot cutting across that sky wasn't some stranger with a familiar name. It was me, the daughter they had learned to overlook, the sister they had quietly stopped believing in, the woman whose ambitions they had treated like a phase that would eventually burn itself out. And here is what made it strange, truly, genuinely strange. I had never deceived them. Not once. I hadn't disappeared into some secret life and emerged transformed. I had told them in plain language, again and again, exactly who I was becoming. They just never cared enough to listen. But to understand how we got to that living room, to that silence, to that moment, you have to go much further back. Back before the air shows and the uniforms and the television cameras. Back before the Air Force and the flight school and the years of grinding, unglamorous work. Back to a small town in Central Texas. Back to the specific morning when my brother's dream quietly became my inheritance, and eventually, the engine of my entire life. My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 35 years old, and this story really began when I was 8. Growing up outside a small Texas town, everyone knew the name Marcus Calloway before they learned mine. Marcus was my older brother. 4 years older, 4 years louder, 4 years more visible in every room he entered. He had the particular magnetism that certain people are born with, the kind that makes adults lean forward when they speak and makes other kids orbit around them on the playground. He didn't demand attention. It simply arrived the way sunlight arrives through an open window. If there was a little league game, Marcus was the one who got written about in the local paper. If there was a school talent show, he was the one people remembered. At family gatherings, relatives didn't ask about me first. They asked about me eventually, after they'd finished with Marcus, in the way you eventually get around to dessert after the main course. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't resentful of this. Not then, not as a child. I adored my brother. I wore the same style of baseball cap he wore. I copied the way he talked. I followed him around our neighborhood with the single-minded devotion of a golden retriever, which is how he started calling me his shadow. It stuck for years. Marcus had one obsession, flight, not the casual, poster-on-the-wall kind of interest, a genuine, consuming passion that organized his entire inner world. Our bedroom was a shrine to aviation. Fighter jet photographs covered every available inch of wall. Military aviation magazines were stacked on the floor because the bookshelves had long since surrendered. Air shows were not entertainment in our household, they were pilgrimages. Every summer, our father loaded us into the truck before the sun was fully up. We drove for hours, sometimes crossing state lines, just to stand in a field and watch military aircraft tear across the sky. I can still feel the way the sound hit your chest, not just your ears, but your chest, your sternum, something deeper. Marcus would stand there with his neck craned back and his eyes tracking every aircraft across the horizon, completely transfixed. One year, after watching a demonstration team perform maneuvers that seemed to defy what physics should permit, Marcus turned to our father with the kind of absolute certainty only the young possess. "That's going to be me someday, Dad." My father looked at him and smiled the way parents smile when they recognize something true. "I know it will." My mother reached over and squeezed Marcus's shoulder. "We know." Nobody laughed, Nobody offered a gentle, qualified version of encouragement. Nobody softened it. They simply believed him. And honestly, so did I. Marcus had the kind of conviction that makes belief contagious. You caught it just from being near him. As the years moved forward, the dream took on structure. Marcus joined Civil Air Patrol. He logged every flight hour he could afford, studied aerodynamics on his own time, taught himself the history of military aviation like a devoted scholar. By high school, teachers spoke about him in the future tense, not if, but when. His whole life pointed in one direction like an arrow nocked and drawn. Then the arrow broke. I was 15 when it happened. Marcus had just turned 19. I remember the exact quality of the silence when he came home that afternoon, not the ordinary silence of a quiet house. Something weighted had settled over everything. He walked in through the back door, set his keys on the counter, and sat at the kitchen table without saying a word. My father went to him immediately. My mother followed. I stayed near the doorway, close enough to know something was deeply wrong, too young to understand exactly what. Nobody explained it to me directly. I pieced it together over the following days. Marcus had failed a medical qualification, a standard physical requirement for the aviation path he'd been building toward his entire life. Not because of anything he'd done wrong, not because he hadn't prepared. His body simply fell outside the thresholds required, a fact that had nothing to do with his intelligence, his work ethic, his love of flying, or the genuine talent he'd developed. He hadn't failed. His body had failed him. There is a specific cruelty in that particular kind of loss, the loss that can't be attributed to insufficient effort. The kind where there's nobody to blame and nothing to fix. Years of dreaming, a single appointment, and then nothing. The months that followed were some of the darkest in our household. Marcus became angry first, then quiet, then bitter, not in some dramatic, obvious way, but slowly and steadily, the way a river changes course so gradually that you don't notice until the banks have moved. My parents circled around him with a protective intensity I had never witnessed before. Every conversation at dinner orbited Marcus. Every family decision was filtered through his pain. Every relative who called asked about him first and asked about him last. I understood it, I did. Grief deserves space, and Marcus was grieving something real. But as the months stretched into a year and then further, something changed in the texture of that understanding. My parents stopped comforting Marcus and started excusing him. Every episode of anger was absorbed without comment. Every moment of bitterness was redirected. The explanation was always the same, offered with genuine compassion. He's been through something devastating. And he had. But that truth gradually became a permission slip. Permission to stay furious, permission to hold everyone at arm's length, permission to stop moving forward while the world moved without him. Meanwhile, I had my own life to live, though nobody seemed particularly interested in the details. One afternoon, cleaning the garage with my father, I found one of Marcus's old aviation magazines stuffed behind a shelf. The cover photograph showed a woman in full flight gear climbing into a fighter jet. Her posture was completely unhurried, completely certain. I stood there in that dusty garage, holding the magazine for what must have been several minutes. Something stirred in my chest. The exact same feeling Marcus used to describe when he talked about aircraft, a restlessness, a recognition, like discovering a frequency your body has always been tuned to. That night, I started researching military aviation on my own. Quietly, without telling anyone, without telling Marcus especially, because I already understood, at 15, that this particular dream was supposed to belong to him alone. At least according to everyone who lived in our house. I kept that understanding to myself, and I kept the research to myself, and I kept the growing certainty quietly in the back of my mind as the years accumulated. The first time Marcus called me the family failure, I was 22. We were at the dinner table on a Sunday evening in early autumn. I had just mentioned, carefully and without excessive enthusiasm, that I was planning to apply for officer training. I wanted to gauge the temperature of the room before saying more. Marcus looked up from his plate with an expression I can only describe as affectionately dismissive. "That's ambitious," he said, in a tone that made the word sound like the opposite of a compliment. My father looked at his food. My mother rearranged something on the table. Neither said anything. Then Marcus leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who has never been corrected in this room and said, "You've always been the family failure, Sarah. W. Hi, start succeeding now." He was smiling when he said it. Not maliciously, that's what made it worse. Casually, the way you say something you've already said 100 times in your own head and have become comfortable with. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Nobody corrected him. My father cleared his throat. My mother stood to get something from the kitchen that didn't urgently need retrieving. Nobody said, "That's not true, don't say that, take that back." The silence hurt more than the words, because silence in a family setting has a meaning. It means we cannot confirm this, but we also cannot bring ourselves to deny it. I looked around the table. I smiled. I nodded at something Marcus said afterward, something I have no memory of. And then I went to bed and made a decision, not a dramatic decision, not the kind you mark on a calendar or share with anyone. A quiet decision. The kind that lives in your body more than your head. I decided that their approval would not be the measure of my success. That whatever I built, I would build it without waiting for them to notice. That the size of my ambition would not be determined by the size of their expectations. I'm not sure I fully understood what that decision would cost me in the years ahead. But I also didn't understand yet what it would give me. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a military training aircraft, I thought about Marcus. Not because I wanted him there. Not because his approval had ever come. I thought about him because I was sitting inside the dream he had wanted more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. And for a brief moment, honestly, only a moment, I felt something like guilt. Then the instructor spoke, and the checklist began, and the feeling was replaced by something simpler and more immediate. The absolute necessity of not failing. I had joined the Air Force the year after that Sunday dinner. My mother assumed I would come home within months. My father said nothing specific, which was its own kind of comment. Marcus, standing in the driveway as I loaded my car, had asked, "How long until you quit?" I said, "I'm not quitting." He shrugged, "We'll see." No embrace, no good luck, no be careful. Just casual, habitual doubt from a man who had never once watched me closely enough to know what I was capable of. The strange thing is that by then, his doubt had become so familiar, it was almost comfortable. Low expectations are easy to carry once you've practiced long enough. Military life rearranged me quickly, and not in the way people expect. The story people want is the one where a young woman discovers toughness she never knew she had. But I had always been tough. I had just been performing softness for a family that needed someone easy to overlook. What military life gave me was something more specific. The discovery that I had been tougher than I knew, and that the work I had been carrying at home had been preparation, whether I recognized it or not. The training was demanding in ways that casual descriptions can't capture. Long before sunrise, long after sunset. Evaluations that assessed not just performance but judgment under pressure, the ability to make correct decisions when incorrect decisions have permanent consequences. The competition was real and serious. Everyone around me was talented. Everyone around me wanted the same limited number of positions. Nobody was interested in your backstory. Nobody adjusted the standard for your circumstances. I loved it. For the first time in my life, nobody knew Marcus Calloway's name. Nobody saw me through the particular lens of being someone's younger sister. Nobody had a version of me already formed in their head that I had to work against. I was simply Sarah Calloway, fully responsible for my own outcomes, fully accountable for my own failures. That freedom was extraordinary. I remember one evening during my first year of training, sitting alone outside the barracks after a day that had pushed everything I had. The Texas heat had finally released its grip. The sky was that deep, saturated blue that appears for about 20 minutes after the sun has set, but before actual darkness. Several aircraft were parked on the flight line, and their silhouettes against the sky were so clean and purposeful that looking at them felt like looking at a sentence that meant exactly what it said. I sat there thinking about the family that was still back in that small town, still having the same conversations, still organizing their emotional world around Marcus and his unresolved grief. And I thought, they think they know me, but what they know is who I was at 12, at 16, At 22, sitting at that dinner table. People who love us sometimes become so attached to an old version of who we were that they stop being able to see who we are. Not out of cruelty. Often out of something closer to loyalty, loyalty to the story they've told about us, which has become a scent. Or they've told about themselves. Back home, the dynamics held. Every phone call with my mother followed a predictable architecture. She would spend the first 20 minutes on Marcus, his job situation, his romantic life, his latest frustration, his newest plan for addressing that frustration. Then she would ask about me, briefly and genuinely, but briefly. Not because she didn't love me, because her worry lived somewhere else. One Christmas Eve, I returned for 4 days. By the second evening, we were sitting in the living room watching football when a commercial appeared on television, military aircraft banking through a clear sky. Marcus pointed at the screen. Remember when that was going to be my whole life? Nobody answered. He looked at me with a slight smile. I guess somebody had to take second place. My mother laughed nervously. My father found something interesting to study in his glass. The strange part was this. It didn't devastate me the way it once might have. Somewhere along the progression of years, I had genuinely stopped requiring his validation. Not completely. There is a part of most younger siblings that never entirely outgrows the need for an older sibling's recognition. But enough. Enough that I could sit in that room and feel something closer to sadness for him than injury for myself. Because what I could see, watching him point at that commercial, was a man who was still living inside a chapter that had closed 15 years earlier. He wasn't being cruel, he was grieving. He had just never found a way to grieve forward. The irony that I never said aloud. Marcus was the one who had given me this love of aviation. Without his obsession, without those summer mornings in the truck before dawn, without those air shows where I felt the sound of engines in my chest, I might have pointed my life in an entirely different direction. He had handed me the thing he lost. He just never realized it. When his path closed, he stopped walking. When mine became difficult, I kept going. Not because I possessed some superior quality of courage, but because by the time I started, I already knew with absolute clarity that nobody was coming to carry me. Nobody was going to lower the bar. The only way forward was to earn it, and somehow that simplicity was clarifying rather than discouraging. My career advanced steadily, year by year. Promotions came, advanced qualifications came. Assignments of increasing complexity and visibility came. Each accomplishment felt meaningful in the private, specific way that achievements feel when you've earned them in rooms where nobody was watching. There is no audience. There is no applause. There is only the knowledge that you made a promise to yourself and kept it. One afternoon, during a particularly routine administrative period at my base in Nevada, an email arrived that I initially assumed was some scheduling notice. Something forgettable. I opened it out of obligation. I read it once, then again, then a third time very slowly because the words weren't rearranging themselves the way I expected. I had been selected for a national air show demonstration assignment, one of the most prestigious and competitive aviation roles in the entire service. The selection process filtered hundreds of applicants down to a handful. Some of the finest pilots I had ever known had applied for similar assignments multiple times without success. My name was on the list. I sat in my chair for several minutes without moving. Through the window, the Nevada flight line stretched out in the afternoon heat, maintenance crews, ground vehicles, aircraft moving with their usual purposeful efficiency. Everything looked exactly the same. Nothing felt the same. That evening I called home. I had resolved to share the news. My mother answered with warmth in her voice. We talked about weather. We talked about a neighbor's new fence. We talked about Marcus's latest career uncertainty. Then I said, as calmly as I could manage, Mom, I got selected for something really significant. Genuine interest, what kind of something? The biggest opportunity of my career, so far, probably. Honey, that's wonderful, a brief pause. Oh, did I tell you Marcus is thinking about a completely different field? He's been so restless lately. The conversation bent, as it always did, in its familiar direction. 20 minutes later, we said goodbye. I sat holding the phone and felt, not anger, not even genuine disappointment. Something more like recognition. A clean, uncomplicated recognition of who this family was and had always been. You cannot demand from people the emotional range they do not currently possess. I put the phone down and went back to preparing for the most demanding assignment of my life. The months of preparation that followed were some of the most intensely satisfying of my career. Every detail required precision. Every maneuver was rehearsed until it wasn't a maneuver anymore, until it became something closer to language, the body communicating with the aircraft in a conversation that had no room for approximation. The standards were not just high, they were the kind of high that clarifies what high has always meant. Back in Texas, a major television network announced coverage of an upcoming national air show. The kind of event that becomes a full weekend for aviation families, planned months ahead, watched by millions. I knew Marcus would watch. He never missed coverage of events like this. I knew my parents would watch with him. And I knew, with a certainty I had never announced to any of them, that they had no idea I would be in it. I hadn't hidden this. I hadn't lied. But I had stopped volunteering information to people who had demonstrated, consistently, that they weren't really listening. Some truths carry more weight when they arrive on their own terms. There is something fitting, I thought, about a family that had watched air shows together my entire childhood, finally watching one that contained me, not as a spectator, not as the shadow trailing along behind, as the pilot at the center of the frame. The morning of the air show began in darkness. Most of the spectators who filled the viewing areas that afternoon had no access to what the hours before a major demonstration looked like. The briefings, the weather assessments, the systems checks, the precise, almost meditative quality of preparation that precedes a performance where any deviation from discipline has consequences that cannot be walked back. I stood beside the aircraft while the sky was still transitioning from black to the gray-blue of early morning. The flight line lights caught the polished surfaces and threw them back in scattered patterns. Ground crews moved around the aircraft with the quiet efficiency of people who have performed these tasks so many times that they no longer have to think about the sequence. I was not nervous in the way people imagine pilots get nervous. There is a different quality to the feeling, not dread, not excitement exactly, but something more like heightened clarity. The awareness that the next several hours will require your complete and undivided self. I thought, there are people who would trade almost anything to be standing where I am standing right now. And one of them is sitting in front of a television 400 miles away, holding a beer and missing a dream he never found a way to grieve and release. My brother was going to watch me fly his dream. I climbed into the cockpit. According to my mother, who described the afternoon in detail later, replaying it with the precision of someone who has lived through something that rearranged their understanding of the world, Marcus arrived early. He brought donuts. He brought coffee. He claimed the seat with the best sightline to the television and settled in with the visible anticipation of someone attending something important, which was exactly what he was doing, even if he had no idea how important. My parents were there. The broadcast started around midday. Marcus, apparently, was already correcting the on-air commentators within the first 10 minutes, identifying aircraft models they misidentified, explaining maneuvers they described imprecisely. This, my mother told me later, made her smile, because for all the years of bitterness and deflection, Marcus had never stopped knowing aviation. That knowledge lived in him the way first languages live in people, deep enough to survive everything else. The demonstration program moved through its segments. Different aircraft, different pilots, different formations. Marcus narrated like a man who has been waiting for this his entire life, and in some sense he had been. Then the broadcast cut to a featured segment. A close-up camera followed a pilot walking across the tarmac toward a waiting aircraft, helmet tucked under one arm, flight suit fitting the way flight suits fit on people who have worn them long enough that the garment and the person have reached an understanding. Unhurried, completely focused, completely present. The announcer's voice came through the television speakers. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Sarah Calloway. My mother said Marcus stopped first. Not stood up, not spoke. Stopped the way a record skips, the way a sentence suddenly breaks off in the middle. He was holding his coffee mug halfway to his mouth, and it just stayed there, suspended, while his eyes locked onto the screen. My mother said she thought she'd misheard the name. She looked at my father. My father was leaning forward with the slow, disbelieving lean of a man whose body has understood something his mind is still catching up to. The camera zoomed closer. There was no misunderstanding, no alternative interpretation, no other person it could be. That was my face, my aircraft, my name on national television. My mother said the room felt like something had been removed from it. Like pressure had dropped, the way it does before weather arrives. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace. That feels like the world pausing to take stock of itself. Nobody spoke for what must have been 2 full minutes. Then the aircraft launched and the demonstration began, and my family watched with an attention I had never received from them in my life. Every maneuver, every formation, every pass across the sky. Marcus never looked away. He didn't reach for his coffee. He didn't correct the commentators. He didn't speak. He just watched his little sister fly. My mother cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. The kind of quiet tears that come when you realize something important and the realization arrives too late to undo what it means about the time before it. My father sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and said nothing for a very long time. When the broadcast ended, nobody rushed to fill the silence. Marcus sat staring at the blank screen. My father stood, walked to the kitchen, stood there for a moment without doing anything in particular, then came back. The silence was the most honest thing that family had shared in years. The next morning, someone knocked on the door of my temporary quarters. A firm knock, not urgent, the knock of someone who has made a decision they are committed to. I opened the door and found Marcus. He looked like he had not slept. Not the disheveled appearance of someone who has been kept awake by external events, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been awake because their own thoughts wouldn't release them. He looked, frankly, like a man who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had spent the night finally putting it down, which is not a restful process. For several seconds, we looked at each other. Then he said, "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. "Come in." The room was small and practically furnished, the way rooms are in temporary military housing. Photographs on a shelf near the window, flight school graduation, squadron pictures, ceremony moments, the accumulated evidence of 12 years. Marcus looked at them for a long moment. His eyes moved through them slowly, reading them the way you read a document you should have read years ago. He shook his head. "I didn't know any of this." "No," I said as gently as I could. "You didn't." We sat down across from each other. The same physical arrangement as 100 family dinners. The same 2 people, completely different room. Marcus was quiet for a while, then he said, "When did all of this happen?" "Which part?" He gestured broadly, the photographs, the career, the air show. "Over the last 12 years, I said. The answer landed between us and neither of us filled the space immediately, because the truth it carried was plain. Nothing I had built was hidden. The information had always been available. He simply hadn't been paying attention. "I feel like an idiot," he said. "Don't," I said, and I meant it. He looked up. "I think you're finally being honest," I said. "That's not the same thing." He sat with that for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." We talked for a long time that morning. Not easily, not fluently, the way people talk when they're navigating something fragile that they both know is fragile and are both trying not to break further. But honestly. More honestly, I think, than Marcus had spoken to anyone in years. At some point he said, "I hated watching that broadcast." I blinked, hated it. "I was proud of you," he looked away, "and I hated it." I understood exactly what he meant. Not jealousy, something older and more specific. Grief that had been living in him, disguised as other feelings, for 15 years. "Tell me," I said. And he did. He talked about the medical disqualification in a way he had never talked about it before, not the facts of it, which I already knew, but the interior experience. The humiliation. The feeling of having an identity dismantled in a single afternoon. The particular shame of losing something to a cause you couldn't fight, couldn't train through, couldn't outwork. The loneliness of grief that other people don't quite understand how to witness. I had always known what Marcus had lost. What I hadn't known were the dimensions of how it had felt to lose it. I kept thinking I'd find something that felt the same, he said, something that replaced it. Did you? The answer was immediate. No, a pause. I made money, I paid rent, I built a decent enough life, but none of it ever felt like. He stopped. Like flying, I finished. Yeah, he stared at the table, then looked at me directly. And then there was you. I stayed quiet. Every time you advanced, every time you got promoted, every time you succeeded, he stopped again, differently this time. Not because he didn't have the words, but because they cost him something to say. It reminded me, and I couldn't fight the thing that had closed my path, so I fought the Remy. Endure instead. I heard that. I let it sit between us without trying to solve it or soften it. The worst part, he continued, is that I knew it was unfair. While I was doing it, I knew. But knowing something is unfair doesn't always stop you from doing it. We sat quietly for a while. Then I said, the dream you had, I wouldn't have found it without you. Every air show we went to, every magazine you left around the house, every time you described what it felt like to watch aircraft perform. I paused. You handed it to me without knowing. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on my brother's face before, something unguarded, something young, something from before the disappointment had fully arrived. You're saying I built the thing that replaced me, he said. I'm saying you gave me something that outlasted your loss. That's not nothing, Marcus. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was different, quieter, more real. I'm sorry, he said. I was wrong about you for a long time. Yes, I said, you were. I didn't say, it's fine. I didn't say, it doesn't matter. Because it had mattered, and pretending otherwise would have cheapened the honesty we were both finally reaching for. A few days later, our parents came. Dinner at a nearby restaurant, public enough to provide structure, private enough for real conversation. The atmosphere was strained at first, the specific strain of people who have something significant to say and are deciding whether to say it. My mother surprised me. She didn't lead with the weather or the neighbors or anything safe. She looked at me directly across the table and said, "We failed you." The directness of it caught me completely off guard. What? We failed you, she repeated. Her voice was controlled, but just barely. We were so worried about Marcus, so focused on supporting him, that we stopped seeing what you needed. My father looked at the tablecloth. Marcus looked at his water glass. Both of them, for once in their lives, not filling the space. You weren't invisible to us, my mother continued. But you were safe. That's how we thought of you. You were the steady one, the one who didn't need us to worry. She said it as though the recognition had cost her something to arrive at, which it had. We thought that was a compliment, my father said quietly, being the one we didn't have to worry about. I know, I said. It wasn't, he said. It was us taking you for granted. Nobody argued. Nobody offered a competing interpretation. Because we all knew, sitting in that restaurant booth, that the most honest version of events had just been put on the table, and the most useful thing to do with honesty is not argue with it. We stayed for 3 hours. We talked about things that had never been said. Some of it was uncomfortable. Most of it was long overdue. None of it was dramatic in the way that confrontations are supposed to be in the movies. There was no shouting, no ultimatums, no cathartic breakdown. Just a family slowly renegotiating the terms of how they saw each other. When we were leaving, standing in the parking lot under a Texas sky, Marcus walked me to my rental car and asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us what you were building?" I looked at him. I did tell you, Marcus. He frowned. What? I told you when I joined the Air Force. I told you when I graduated training. I told you when I got promoted. I mentioned assignments, qualifications, milestones. I paused. The information was always there. He was quiet for a moment. Then, we just never asked follow-up questions. No, I said, you never did. Those words, simple, undramatic, accurate, seemed to land harder than any argument I could have made. Because there's a difference between not knowing and not asking. We all know that difference, even when we'd prefer not to examine it too closely. On the flight back to Nevada, I sat by the window and watched clouds stretch below the aircraft in long, unbroken formations. From 30,000 feet, the problems that feel enormous at ground level look different. Not small, distances don't lie, but more comprehensible. You can see their edges. You can see where they end. I thought about resentment, which I had carried for years in a quiet, low-grade way, not the burning kind, the dull-ache kind. The feeling of being perpetually adjacent to where the attention was, never quite at the center. The feeling of being the child nobody worried about, which sounds like a blessing until you understand that worry, in the particular dialect of family love, is also a form of attention. And I thought, my parents loved me. They had simply worried about Marcus more. Those are not the same thing. Understanding that difference doesn't erase the years, but it does change the weight of them. Hurt that can be understood can be processed in a way that hurt without explanation cannot. I pressed my forehead lightly against the LD window and watched the clouds pass. In the months that followed, something quiet and genuine began to shift in my family. My mother started calling more frequently, but differently, not to relay information about Marcus, but to ask about me. The first time she called specifically to ask what I was working on, I was standing in my kitchen after a long duty day, and I almost laughed from the sheer unexpectedness of it. We talked for nearly an hour. Aviation, career ambitions, travel, life. When we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while with the phone still in my hand, smiling at nothing in particular. Healing rarely announces itself. Sometimes it arrives through a phone call that is different from the phone calls that came before it. My father sent a letter, an actual paper letter, which was so unlike him that I read it 3 times to confirm it was real. Tucked inside was a newspaper clipping, a local feature about military aviation, nothing extraordinary. But his handwriting on the attached note said, "Thought of you when I saw this. We're proud of you. Love, Dad." 14 words, I probably read them 20 times. Because that is how emotional debt works, not dramatically, but incrementally. Small deposits after a long drought carry extraordinary weight. The largest change, however, came from Marcus. And it came gradually, over months, in the particular way that genuine personal change moves, not in a single decision, but in a series of smaller ones, each one building on the last. He stopped measuring his path against mine. He stopped treating my successes as comments on his failures. He stopped living, as far as I could tell, inside the chapter that had closed 15 years ago. One evening he called me, unexpectedly, and there was a quality in his voice I hadn't heard in years. "I signed up for flight lessons," he said. I sat down. "What?" He laughed, a real laugh, the kind without defensiveness built into it. I know. "Marcus." "I'm not trying to become anything I can't be," he said. I know what that appointment meant. It didn't change. But there's a difference between flying commercially and flying military jets, and I've been so focused on the door that closed that I never looked at the ones that were still open. How was the first lesson? A pause, and then a sound I hadn't heard from my brother in longer than I could clearly remember. Pure, uncomplicated excitement, the sound of someone in contact with the thing they love. "Incredible," he said. "It was incredible, Sarah." For the first time in years, I heard the boy from those childhood air shows. The boy who stood in a field with his neck craned back and his eyes tracking every aircraft across the sky. The boy who had handed me his dream without knowing and then spent years not understanding why that dream looked so familiar on me. He hadn't recovered the exact thing he'd lost. He'd found something else, something real, something genuinely his, something that had been waiting there while he spent 15 years staring at a closed door. The following summer, a major air show came to Texas. My whole family attended together. Not because I asked, because they wanted to. We stood near the flight line before the event began, the 5 of us, my parents, Marcus, me, and the accumulated weight and texture of everything we'd been through and were still working through. Children ran past with foam earplugs dangling from their necks. Veterans sat in folding chairs with unit patches on their hats and memories on their faces. Families spread out across the grass with blankets and coolers, and the particular ease of people who have been coming to these events their whole lives. I looked at my brother. He was wearing an aviation cap that was clearly older than most of the crowd around us. It looked like something he'd bought in the early 2000s and had never thrown away because some things you hold on to, even when holding on doesn't make rational sense. The sight of it made me love him in a way that was different from how I had loved him before, more complete maybe, because now it included understanding. Not just his best self, the charismatic brother from childhood, but his wounded self, the man who had spent 15 years trying to protect himself from a loss he never learned to grieve properly. We watched the demonstration together. Nobody kept score, nobody made comparisons, nobody reached for an old argument. Afterward, sitting in folding chairs as the crowd began to disperse, Marcus bumped my shoulder with his, the kind of casual, affectionate gesture that predates all our complications, something from before everything got complicated. "I was wrong about you," he said. "You were wrong about a lot of things," I said. He laughed, absolutely fair, then quieter. "I'm proud of you, Sarah, genuinely." I looked at him. Those 4 words, "I'm proud of you," from this specific person, in this specific context, after everything that had me before them, landed differently than any broadcast ever had. The millions of people who had watched a screen on a Saturday afternoon, that moment had its own meaning, its own satisfaction. But this was different. This was being seen by someone who had spent years deliberately not seeing me, finally choosing to look. That is a different kind of recognition, entirely. I have thought about this story many times since then, trying to identify what it means beyond its own specific details. Because every family has its version of this story, the overlooked one and the celebrated one, the wound that becomes the excuse, the silence that becomes permission, the slow drift of attention toward whoever is struggling loudest. What I have come to understand is this: the people who know us longest do not always know us best. They hold an old map and keep navigating by it even when the terrain has completely changed. This is not cruelty. It is a kind of loyalty to a story that gave them comfort and has outlasted its accuracy. And the danger, for the person being navigated by an outdated map, is waiting. Waiting for the map to be updated. Waiting for someone to say, "I see you now." Waiting for recognition to arrive before deciding your work is real. I spent years doing work that had no audience, building something that nobody in my family was watching. Earning qualifications in rooms where the only people who knew what they meant were the people who had earned them alongside me. And here is what I learned. The work was real whether they watched or not. The accomplishment existed independent of their awareness of it. My worth was not a function of their perception of my worth. Once I genuinely understood that, not as a saying, not as something to tell yourself on difficult evenings, but as a fact about reality, everything became lighter. Not easier, lighter. If you have ever been the quiet one, the steady one, the one nobody worried about because worry is a strange and backwards form of love and it was directed elsewhere. If you have ever built something in silence and wondered whether it counted without an audience. It counts. The people around you may not see it yet. They may be looking at an old map. They may be so focused on someone else's loss that they haven't turned around to witness your becoming. But their failure to witness, it does not make it any less real. Keep going, keep building. Keep becoming whoever you were always meant to be, with or without the applause. Because some days, the cameras turn, and when they do, there will be no mistaking what you have made of the life they underestimated. If this story touched something in you, reminded you of someone you know, or a chapter of your own life that you're still making sense of, take a moment with it. And if you know someone who is quietly building something without recognition, the most powerful thing you can do is simply ask them about it. Ask them what they're working on. Listen like their answer matters. Because it does.